friends. Welcome to More of Jesus. This is Pastor Amie. People ask me sometimes, why do you so often include stories about like exorcisms or demons in your teaching time at dinner church, in the Jesus stories, which is an excellent question. People, a lot of times, I think it makes people feel uncomfortable, which is easy to understand. Some people feel scared by stuff like that. And it's also, for some people, just really wacky. Like, we don't think like this. We don't talk like this a lot in our modern culture anymore. And so why are you kind of being religiously wacky and talking about this kind of stuff? And so one of the answers that is, I think, just pretty straightforward is that there are so many exorcisms in the Gospels and the stories about Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's really difficult to read any one of those accounts of Jesus' life and go 3 chapters without encountering some sort of demon or evil spirit or exorcism that Jesus does. And so in order for this to be a beneficial thing for us to talk about, learn about, and study, we need to first crawl into the ancient Jewish mindset about what they were thinking about the spirit world and about demons, and understand the stories as they tell them, and then crawl back out into our modern mindset and say, what does that mean for us? You'll hear me say this often, but none of sacred scripture was written in like a vacuum separate from a cultural context. So when we talk about problematic passages or troubling passages or scary passages, we must understand the cultural context that we are dealing with and understand how those people in that time were thinking about this topic so we can understand why they wrote what they wrote. Now, the New Testament was a collection of writings written 2,000-ish years ago in Jewish Palestine. All of the earliest Christians were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. And so to understand how they viewed religious topics and spirituality, we need to understand a little bit of the ancient Jewish understanding of these evil spirits or demons. Now, what I think is fascinating is that when you take the sacred Jewish scriptures, the entire Tanakh, the whole entire Old Testament, it's about 80,000 words. There is hardly anything in there about demons, about evil spirits, and about exorcisms. It's just not really there. If you look at one kind of example in 1 Samuel chapter 16, where Saul was being tormented by some sort of spirit, that's about it in all of the pages of the Old Testament. Nothing. Nada. Nil. Now, the surrounding cultures did have a lot of stories about evil spirits or evil gods, but the Jewish people did not. And one of the explanations for that is that very early in the Torah, the Jews were commanded not to practice any sorts of magic or sorcery or evil arts. Yahweh commanded that they not focus on the darkness, that they not focus on sorcery, on evil spirits. And so that might explain why out of the 80,000 words of the Hebrew Bible that there's hardly any reference to any kind of demon. Basically, all they really called demons, when they talked about demons, they were talking about the gods of the surrounding cultures, because they were a tribal people who lived with lots of surrounding tribes, and they were influenced by these tribes and their religions, but they were taught by Yahweh that these gods of the other tribes were false gods. If anything, they were demons that were trying to lead people astray. Now, when you compare that with the ancient Egyptian, Persian, Greek, Babylonian, Ugaritic, Mesopotamian stories, there were so many stories from these other ancient cultures who were all polytheistic, had multiple gods, and they had good gods and they had evil gods, and they had good forces and they had evil forces, and there was all kinds of scary stuff flying around all the time for all of these other cultures. But the ancient Jews seemed to live in a community and in a worldview and in a mindset within the safety and the protection of Yahweh. Their thought world was safe and secure with one God who was their just and loving and good and gracious protector, provider, and defender. They didn't seem to occupy themselves with sorcery, evil, and darkness. So then you might say, well, then blam, why is the New Testament full of these stories of demons and evil spirits and exorcisms? What happened in their thought world in that 400 years between the two testaments? Now, we can get clues from the Talmud. This is such an important and helpful and informative document because the Talmud is the extra outside of their Bible literature that they wrote about how to interpret their scriptures. And it gave them extra Jewish teaching, so it gives us a glimpse into how they and what they were thinking about their own scriptures and about their society in general during this time. Not only that, there's a lot of information there. The Talmud is about 37 times longer than the Hebrew Bible. There's 3 million or so words when you think about the two different versions of it, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. Now, in the Jerusalem Talmud, this is also so fascinating. There is only one reference in the entire thing to demons. And the Hebrew word that's used there is mazikin or mazikim, which literally is one who does harm. Now, when you look at the Babylonian Talmud, there are a lot more stories and words for demons and talk about exorcisms because it is interesting that they are influenced by Babylon. Their surrounding culture is one of those worlds that was scary because the thought world of Babylon had lots of magic, lots of superstition, lots of sorcery, lots of good gods, evil gods, scary stuff flying around, flitting around. And so the Babylonian Talmud had them thinking a lot more about that kind of thing, whereas the Jerusalem Talmud does not. I think that is so fascinating. And then the Greco-Roman thought comes into play too here in the New Testament. And we get all of that kind of polytheistic influence. So by the time the New Testament is written and these Jews are living in the area of Palestine in the New Testament, they have really been influenced by the thought world of a lot of surrounding cultures. And to them, what we can tell from the New Testament is that demons or evil spirits were invisible things that could afflict people with disease, kind of take control of somebody's mind and make them act in ways that they wouldn't normally act and do harm to themselves or to others. And they could lead people astray and deceive them and get them to do things that are in opposition to God's goodwill for the world. Now, this was the world, the spiritual landscape that Jesus was born into. We don't have time to look at a comprehensive list of all of the exorcisms Jesus performed, but what is noteworthy in the New Testament and in the Gospels is that every single time Jesus encountered a so-called demon in this culture, whether it was causing a sickness or somebody was mind controlled or whether it was causing someone to cause harm to themselves or others or cause mischief, every single time Jesus encountered one, no big deal, NBD. He restored the human being with a single word, with a single command, and the demon or the evil influence had to leave. Jesus didn't mess around. Jesus didn't have trouble with them. Jesus wasn't scared of them. As a matter of fact, it says almost in many of the circumstances that they were even scared at the sight of Jesus. And he just sent them away from the persons that they were troubling, which tells us we don't need to be scared either. And one of my big takeaways after reading and researching this week was I want to live in that world that the Old Testament Jews lived in, where Yahweh was their provider, their protector, their defender, their just and loving and good and gracious God that kept them safe. They didn't have to worry or mess around with the evil arts. But the second thing that I thought as I was studying and researching this week, that one reference in the Jerusalem Talmud to demons, the word mazikin, one who causes harm. I started to think, if these ancient people had some kind of conception of something that was invisible that caused harm, they're really not so far off track. They're really not so wacky in terms of modern understandings of the world as we might originally think. Do we have any modern forces that are invisible to the naked eye, that oppose God's will, that want to destroy minds and bodies of people, that want to make people sick, that want to cause harm. Shoot, I don't know. How about viruses, bacteria? When we think about mental health and the complete uncharted frontier that's left to discover about mental health, but like the little tiny bit that we do know maybe about brain changes or chemical imbalances or things that cause chemical deficiencies in the brain, those are all like invisible things that cause a lot of harm. And like mind-altering substances like alcohol and drugs, they can enter a human and cause them to act in ways that they would not normally act and cause a great deal of harm. Aren't we still battling invisible things that try to cause us harm, that try to oppose God's healing redemption of the world? These ancient people weren't that dumb. So if you are somebody who is trying to study Scripture, trying to read the New Testament, for example, the stories of Jesus, and you encounter these stories of demons and exorcisms, and then you say, wait, that sounds a lot like epilepsy, or that sounds a lot like mental health, or that sounds a lot like maybe what they were calling a demon, which is an invisible thing that does harm to someone, we can call it what modern people call it. And Jesus still didn't mess around with it and didn't let it harm that person's body, soul, or mind. But in every instance, when Jesus encountered that, he sent that away, said, stop attacking this person, leave them alone, and restored the person. And I don't know about you, but really, I want to live in a thought world, in a spiritual landscape, in a trusting relationship with God, kind of like it sounds like the Old Testament folks were doing, where they weren't afraid of all of those things. They didn't seem to occupy a lot of their minds. Instead, they were surrounded by one loving and just and good and gracious God who was their protector, their provider, their defender. They could be safe and secure with their God. So I hope this was helpful, and we'd love to see you in Dinner Church soon.